In the opening days of the Second World War at sea, the U-boats of the German Kriegsmarine reigned supreme. Attacking in deadly coordinated wolf packs, these stealthy vessels cut swaths through Allied shipping convoys in the North Atlantic, threatening to sever Britain's vital lifeline to North America and starve the island nation into submission. But this happy time, as U-boat crews called it, was not to last, for by 1943 major developments in Allied naval technology and tactics, from radar and sonar to escort carriers and long-range patrol aircraft, had succeeded in turning the tide, putting the once feared U-boat arm firmly on the back foot. Meanwhile, the German surface fleet, never large to begin with, remained largely bottled up in port, its commanders hesitant to commit their expensive capital ships to battle. With the Allies pushing into mainland Europe, first in Italy, then in France, the German navy began to look increasingly irrelevant. In response to this changing strategic situation, the Kriegsmarine decided to switch gears and think small, deploying a variety of bizarre miniature attack craft, from human torpedoes and miniature submarines to frogmen and explosive remote-controlled motorboats. While certainly creative, the combat performance of these weapons of desperation was less than impressive and ultimately had little impact on the course of the war. So today, the story of Nazi Germany's hilariously awful Naval Special Forces. As covered in our previous video, the midget submarine that changed the course of World War II, several nations deployed midget submarines during the Second World War. The first were the Italians, whose elite Decima Flottiglia MAS unit used human torpedoes called Laughably to attack ships in the British ports of Alexandria, Gibraltar, and Valletta in Malta in 1941. The Japanese also used Type A Ko-Hayateki midget submarines during the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, and in 1942 raids on Sydney Harbor, Australia, and Diego Suarez, Madagascar. However, the most successful users of midget submarines were the British, whose four-man X-craft were used to great effect in both the European and Pacific theatres. Nazi Germany was a relative latecomer when it came to naval special forces, having little use for such units in the early part of the war. But as Allied naval and air superiority rendered the regular surface and submarine forces of the Kriegsmarine increasingly ineffective and an invasion of Western Europe became imminent, the German High Command realized that smaller, stealthier weapons would be needed to defeat the coming tide of enemy shipping. And so, in late 1943, Admiral Karl Donitz, head of the U-boat arm, approved the establishment of an elite naval attack unit under the command of Rear Admiral Helmuth Hay. Though officially known as Marine Einsatzabteilung, or Special Naval Attack Force, these forces were colloquially known as the Kleinkampfverbände, or K-Verbände, or simply K units. The K-men who made up these units were carefully selected and put through grueling training courses to weed out all but the best of the best. These courses included not only training in explosives handling, hand-to-hand combat, escape and evasion, and naval architecture, but also punishing physical challenges like day-long forced marches over sand and sleeping outdoors on the Baltic coast in winter. To preserve the secrecy of the unit, the K-men were confined to their headquarters in Heiligenhafen and forbidden from interacting with civilians. Once a month, the entire unit was permitted to visit a local cinema under heavy guard to prevent anyone from talking. Steadily, the unit was whittled down to a core of highly trained men who, in the words of Admiral Hay, with a few members and with less means, still be able to cause the enemy great loss. The first specialized weapon developed for the K-Verbände was a human torpedo called the Neger. This craft was the brainchild of naval engineer Richard Moore, who designed it as a way to use up surplus stocks of U-boat torpedoes piling up in naval storehouses. The name Neger, meaning Negro, was derived from its designer's surname, the German form of Moore, a black person from North Africa. The main body of the Neger was built from a standard G7E electric torpedo, stripped of its warhead and fitted with a cramped cockpit and simple steering controls for a single pilot. Sunk beneath this was a regular G7E torpedo. The Neger was not a true submarine, being incapable of diving. Instead, it relied on its low profile in the water and the cover of darkness to approach its target undetected. The pilot would then align his craft with the target using a metal spike mounted ahead of the cockpit, then start and release the underslung torpedo. Unfortunately, in testing, the release mechanism exhibited a disturbing tendency to jam, causing the Neger and its pilot to be dragged uncontrollably towards the target at a speed of 30 knots. The first prototypes were built with open cockpits, but these had an annoying habit of flooding in all but the calmest of seas. This was corrected by fitting the cockpit with a transparent plexiglass dome, which strangely could only be opened from the outside. As we shall see, this was a design flaw which was to have tragic consequences. Once sealed inside, the pilot breathed using an oxygen rebreather of the type used to escape sinking submarines, which used a chemical scrubber to filter out carbon dioxide from its breath. Navigation was rudimentary, performed using the stars and a compass strapped to the pilot's wrist. The vessel had a top speed of around a brisk walk at 3 knots and an endurance of around 10 hours, meaning that the craft had to be launched within 15 nautical miles or 28 kilometers of its target. The first raid was planned for the night of April the 15th, 1944, against the Allied-held ports of Anzio and Nettuno on the west coast of Italy. Conducted by the Cavalbande's 261st Flotilla, the attack was launched from the town of Pratica de Mar, 29 kilometers away from the target. But almost from the start, the mission was plagued with bad luck. The vessels were to be transported from their hiding places in the town to the beach for launching using specially built handcarts. However, the primitive roads of rural Italy tended to destroy the cart's aircraft tires. In response, the Germans hired local Italian citizens to clear the 2-mile road to the beach of Sharp Rocks. The attack, originally planned for the 15th, was postponed until the 20th to give the pilots a cloudless sky to navigate by. But as the crews and 500 German troops manhandled the vessels down to the beach, trouble struck once again. Hidden sandbars just offshore made it difficult to launch the vessels, causing many to become stranded. Of the 37 craft brought to the beach, only 23 were successfully started, while 14 became stranded, leaving only 9 to carry out the attack. These 9 split up into 3 attack groups led by Lieutenants Koch, Sabicki, and Pothorst. Koch's group was tasked with attacking the port of Nettuno, while the other 2 were attack Anzio. To help guide them to their targets, German forces arranged to light a bonfire on the coast near the German front line, while anti-aircraft batteries were ordered to fire tracer rounds towards Anzio at 20-minute intervals. The 9 vessels set off at 10 p.m., reaching their targets in the early morning hours of the 21st. To the pilots' shock, however, they found the harbours nearly empty. The Allied cargo ships they'd been assured of had already offloaded their cargo and left. Undaunted, the pilots fired at targets of opportunity and successfully destroyed a small escort ship, 2 transports, and a coastal defense gun mounted on the harbour mole. Of the 9 vessels launched, 8 returned to base at around 10 p.m. The 9th was found washed ashore near Anzio, its pilot dead. Unable to open his craft's hatch, he had succumbed to carbon dioxide poisoning. Even grimmer, another vessel with a dead pilot was found tossing in the surf near the launch beach of Pratica de Mar. In their frustration at being unable to free the craft from the sandbar, the launch crew had simply abandoned it, leaving the pilot to suffocate. It was an inauspicious start for the K-units. For the destruction of a few unimportant ships, the Kriegsmarine had revealed the existence of its new secret weapon to the Allies, but the K-men would soon get another chance to prove their worth when 2 months later Allied forces landed in Normandy. The Cavalbande was redeployed to Ville-sur-Mer in Normandy, from where it could attack Allied shipping off the British-controlled Sword Beach. Learning from their mistakes in Italy, the Germans carefully selected their launch site, which had concrete ramps and a steeper drop-off. However, the waters off the French coast were a completely different animal than Anzio. The tidal currents were faster than the Neger's maximum cruising speed, meaning the craft could only be launched during certain narrow windows when the ebb tide would carry them to their targets and the flood tide would take them back to their launching point. These conditions only occurred 4 days a month, and since the craft could only operate after 10 or 11 p.m., this had left them with only 2 hours to reach their target and carry out their mission. Nonetheless, on the night of July the 5th, 1944, a force of 40 vessels sailed out of Villiers-sur-Mer. Only 9 returned, but the commander reported an impressive score of 1 cruiser, 2 destroyers, 1 steamer, and 2 tank landing craft sunk, and 1 cruiser, 1 destroyer, 2 steamers, and 2 landing craft damaged by torpedoes. However, these claims don't line up with British records, which only recorded the loss of 2 small minesweepers, HMS Magic and HMS Cato. Undaunted, the K-men tried again, launching another attack on the night of July the 7th, but this mission was a complete failure, with not one of the 21 vessels launched returning to base. And for the loss of so many highly trained men, the flotilla only managed to sink the minesweeper HMS Pylades and damage Polish cruiser Dragon, which was later scuttled as a harbour breakwater. This disaster revealed that the Cavalbande had lost the vital element of surprise. The Allies were now alert to the German secret weapon and had taken appropriate precautions. Ever-present air patrols also doomed the surface-bound craft, as Kriegsmarine captain Frederick Bonn later recalled. Frequently, day broke before my one-man submarines had returned, and Allied fighters strafed them on the way back to the mouth of the One River. Of the submarines I sent out, I recovered only 10 to 15%. Approximately 200 small submarines were lost through Allied strafing attacks. I've seen at one time as many as 50 to 100 fighters circling the bay like hawks hunting for these submarines. They were very persistent. Once they mistook a wreck caught in a strong current for a submarine wake and attacked and re-attacked it for half an hour. Realizing that the vessel's inability to dive made it dangerously vulnerable, the Germans produced an improved version called the Marder, or Pine Martin. The Marder was fitted with ballast tanks, allowing it to dive to a depth of 25 meters. The pilots dome was also made openable from the inside. The new submarines were first deployed on the night of August 2nd, 1944, when 58 were launched against Allied shipping off Courcelles-sur-Mer. But the improved craft proved no more effective than their predecessors, sinking the destroyer escort HMS Quorn and the minesweeper HMS Guersafe at the loss of 41 Marder. 2 weeks later, on the night of August 16th, 42 vessels torpedoed the French battleship Corbeil, the barrage balloon vessel HMS Fratten, and one landing craft for the loss of 26 of their own. Unknown to the Germans, the Corbeil was nothing but an empty shell scheduled to be scuttled as a harbour breakwater. But before any more attacks could be launched, the Allies broke out from the Normandy beachhead and overran the Quai Vendée launching sites, forcing the unit to withdraw from northern France. The last mass attack by German human torpedoes took place in September 1944 against shipping in southern France, where the Allies had landed on August 15th in Operation Dragoon. Unfortunately, the mission was a complete failure, with 14 of the 30 Marder launched being destroyed or captured for the loss of 0 Allied ships. Yet sporadic small-scale attacks continued to be launched in German-occupied Low Countries, with one of the last Allied ships to be lost to these weapons being the trawler HMS Colsay, sunk off Ostend, Belgium on November 2nd, 1944. And while the Germans did try to develop a faster, longer-range version of the Marder called the High or Shark, this performed so poorly in testing that the project was quickly cancelled. Yet while the physical impact of German human torpedoes was negligible, their psychological impact was considerable. A fact the Germans exploited by throwing hundreds of clear plastic domes into the sea around Normandy to keep Allied sentries on their toes. But these hastily developed vessels were far from the only midget submarines deployed by the Germans in World War II. In September 1943, the British Royal Navy launched Operation Source, an attempt to sink the German battleship to Pitts in her Norwegian anchorage using X-craft midget submarines. While the mission succeeded in severely damaging the Tirpitz, 5 of the 6 X-craft were lost and their crews killed or captured. After examining the captured British midget subs, the Kriegsmarine's Construction Bureau began developing a version of their own, designated the Hecht or Pike. Measuring 10 meters long and manned by a crew of 2, the Hecht was powered by a regular 12-horsepower electric torpedo motor, giving it an extremely low speed of 4 knots and endurance of only 69 nautical miles or 128 kilometers. Like the X-craft, the Hecht was designed to carry a large explosive charge in its bow, which could be dropped beneath the keel of a ship at anchor. However, at the insistence of Admiral Donitz, the craft was later fitted with 2 torpedoes for longer-ranged attacks, further decreasing its speed and range. As the Hecht was intended to slip through torpedo nets and other obstacles, it was not initially fitted with hydroplanes, trim being controlled by a system of sliding weights. In testing, however, this system proved completely unworkable and hydroplanes were subsequently fitted. Nonetheless, the submarine remained extremely difficult to control. While 53 Hecks were produced by Germania Werft in Kiel, their disappointing performance meant they were never deployed in combat. Instead, they were used to train the crews of other midget submarine types. The Hecht was eventually developed into a far more capable craft known as the Seehund or Seal, measuring 45 feet long, manned by a crew of 2 and armed with 2 external torpedoes. The Seehund was effectively a miniature U-boat equipped with a diesel-electric propulsion system that gave it a top speed of 7 knots surfaced and 3 knots submerged, a range of 300 kilometers and a maximum diving depth of 50 meters. Furthermore, the tiny craft proved remarkably immune to depth charges, which tended to simply toss them around without inflicting major damage. A total of 285 Seehund were manufactured, the type being first seen in combat on New Year's Eve 1944 off of the Netherlands. Unfortunately, the flotilla ran into a violent storm which sank all but 2 of the 18 submarines. From then on, Seehund largely operated off of the German coast and in the English Channel, scoring their first victory off Great Yarmouth in February 1945. During their brief career, these craft proved the most successful of all German midget subs, sinking 8 ships for a total of 17,300 gross registered tons for the loss of 35 submarines. And as with the Neggers and the Marders, the psychological effect of the Seehund was considerable. Their hulls were too small for Allied sonar to get a good signal return, and their slow, quiet electric motors made them almost immune to detection by hydrophone, making them nearly invisible to Allied anti-submarine escorts. However, despite their relative success, like all such weapons, the Seehund had almost no impact on the course of the war, with Admiral Sir Charles Little, Commander-in-Chief at Portsmouth, later stating, "Fortunately for us, these damn things arrived too late in the war to do any damage." Seehund were last deployed on April the 28th and May the 2nd, 1945, when they were used to resupply the besieged German garrison at Dunkirk. Instead of torpedoes, the submarines carried special containers nicknamed butter torpedoes filled with food. On the return voyage, the containers were used to carry mail. After the war, France received 4 Seehund as war reparations and commissioned them into the French Navy, where they served until 1953. Much smaller and far less successful than the Seehund was the Moch or Salamander, 37 meters long, crewed by 1 pilot and armed with 2 torpedoes. Like the Hecht, the Moch was powered powered by a regular electric torpedo motor, giving it a top speed of 5 knots and a range of 35 nautical miles or 64 kilometers. While 393 Molch were built before the end of the war, they proved a dismal failure, its complicated control system proving too much for a single pilot to handle. Deployed against Allied shipping off the coast of southern France and the Netherlands in late 1944, the craft sank only 7 small ships and 102 missions for the loss of 80 submarines. Due to this poor performance, like the Hecht, they were soon relegated to training duty. But the smallest submarine in the Kriegsmarine arsenal was the Biber, or Beaver. Designed by Kriegsmarine captain Hans Bartels, the Biber measured only 9 meters long, and much like the Molch, had a crew of 1 and was armed with 2 torpedoes. However, it was also fitted with a gasoline engine, giving it a surface speed of 6.5 knots and a range of 100 nautical miles or 180 kilometers. 393 Bibers were built by Flundwerk of Lübeck, the first type being deployed in August 1944 against Allied shipping off the coast of southern France. However, like the Molch submarines they operated alongside, the Biber scored no victories. The type later briefly operated from Viekamp harbour in France before being withdrawn to Rotterdam, the Netherlands, where, as part of the 261st Flotilla, they operated against Allied shipping in the Schlett estuary. Given the submarine's slow top speed and great distances from their operating bases to their targets, missions could last 24 hours or more. In order to keep their crews alert, they were issued with an experimental drug mixture known as D9, a mixture of oxycodone, cocaine, and methamphetamine. Despite the chemical assistance, however, the Biber proved no more effective than the Molch, with most falling victim to Allied warships or aircraft. The only confirmed victory scored by the type was against the American cargo ship Alan A. Dale, which was torpedoed and sunk off the Dutch coast on September 23, 1944. 1 month later, in January 1945, 6 Biber were used in an attack attempt against the Soviet battleship Archangels at its anchorage in Murmansk, northern Russia. The midget subs were strapped to the decks of full-size U-boats, which would ferry them to the target and release them just outside the harbour. Unfortunately, when the carrier U-boat surfaced, 4 of the 6 Biber were found to be severely damaged and the operation was called off. Ironically, the most effective special naval weapon would turn out to be one that required no vehicle at all, the Kampfschwimmer, or frogmen. Equipped with a rubber dry suit, flippers, and a combat rebreather set, these men were trained to stealthily infiltrate enemy harbours and place explosive limpet mines on the hulls of ships at anchor. But by the time the frogmen units became operational in June 1944, German forces were being pushed back from the coast, making the targets that they'd trained to attack increasingly scarce. Consequently, they were reassigned to attacking bridges and other river infrastructure to slow the Allied advance across Europe. On June 23, 1944, just 3 weeks after D-Day, German frogmen successfully blew up 2 bridges over the Orne River, losing just 1 man in the process. Later in August, the unit placed explosives against the canal lock gates in Antwerp, Belgium, knocking them out for 3 months. Successful operations were also carried out against Arnhem in the Netherlands, Stettin in Poland, and along the Oder River in Germany. But even these highly effective units could do little to turn the tide of the war. In less than a year after the Kampfschwimmer were first deployed, Nazi Germany surrendered to the Allies. The failures of the K-Verbande and its midget submarines were typical of many Nazi secret weapon projects, from jet aircraft to ballistic missiles. While conceptually clever, they were developed and rushed into service too hastily to be effective in combat. Furthermore, by the time such weapons appeared, Germany's crumbling industrial and strategic situation meant that the war was already lost. It was simply a case of, quite literally, too little, too late.